Have you ever had something torn away from you? Not just a thing, not just a person, but a piece of your own soul, the very ground you stand on. When the smoke clears and all you're left with is a hollow space where your world used to be, what do? Do you crumble? Or do you find a new kind of strength in the ruins? This is a story about that choice. It's a story about a woman who lost everything, and in the emptiness that followed, found a weapon more powerful than any sword. Welcome to Revenge Pains. I'm your narrator, Runa, and today we journey back to a time of gods and kings, of fjords and fire, to tell the story of a vengeance that wasn't about blood, but about survival. This is the story of Runa and the whisper of the grove. The air in the fjord was a guest that had overstayed its welcome, heavy and silent, thick with the ghosts of burnt wood and vaporized sacred herbs. Runa stood before the ruin, a black skeleton of what was once the heart of her world. The great Yggdrasil Grove, a place that had echoed with chants and whispers for generations, was now a charcoal mosaic of tragedy. Its silence was louder than any scream. Her face, a mask of grief etched by age and lined with soot, was as still as the fjord's dark water at dawn. Only her hands moved, trembling as they clutched a small carved piece of yew, the fehu rune, the symbol of wealth, of cattle, of beginnings. She had pressed it into her apprentice's palm just yesterday, a lifetime ago. "For your first solo divination, Astrid," she had said, her voice warm with a pride that felt like a distant, impossible memory now. The present horror blurred, its edges softened by the smoke and her own shock, and the past rushed in to fill the void. She saw it again, not as a memory but as a recurring wound. The sleek lines of a longship cutting through the morning mist, not with the familiar markings of a neighboring Jarl, but with a stark white cross painted crudely over its dragon prow. Then the men, but not warriors in the way she knew them. These men moved with a rigid certainty, their leather tunics adorned with the same white cross. And at their head, two figures who were the twin axes of her world's destruction. First, Jarl Einar, a man she had known since he was a boy stealing honeycakes from the summer feasts. Now his face was a fortress, his eyes holding the cold ambition of a man who would trade his own soul for a foothold in the new world being forged by southern kings and their one jealous god. Beside him, a shadow given human form, Brother Thaddeus. He was a man from the south, skeletal and severe in his black robes, his face pale and pinched as if he were perpetually smelling something foul. He was the voice in Einar's ear, the poison in the well of their community. The flashback sharpened. Thaddeus, his voice a dry rasp, pointed a bony finger at the ancient, silver-barked ash at the center of the grove. "A den of demons," he'd shrieked, his accent mangling their tongue. "A festering sore on this land which cries out for the cleansing fire of the Lord." And then Astrid, her apprentice, a girl on the cusp of womanhood with the fire of the old ways burning bright in her eyes. Runa saw her, clear as day, stepping forward. Not with a weapon, but with her hands outstretched, a desperate shield of flesh and faith against their iron and righteousness. "This is a sacred place," Astrid's voice, so young, so brave, rang through the clearing. "The spirits of the land dwell here. To harm it is to harm yourselves, to harm the very soul of this fjord." Thaddeus had simply laughed, a crackling, humorless sound. He looked to Einar, his eyes glittering with a zealot's fire. And Einar, the boy she had once chased from her herb garden, the man whose child she had helped bring into the world, simply held Thaddeus's gaze. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was the true moment of the world's ending. Not the chaos that followed, not the frightened shouts or the crackle of flame. It was the quiet, deliberate nod. The sight of the first torch, its flame a hungry orange tongue in the morning light, sailing through the air and landing in the dry thatch of the ceremonial hut. Runa had been held back, forced to watch as the heart of her faith was ripped out and burned on a pyre of progress. She didn't remember screaming. She only remembered the profound, hollowing certainty that her world had not just been broken. It had been erased. The power she held, the communion with the spirits, the wisdom of the ages passed down to her. It was all smoke and ash. She stood there, a spiritual leader whose spirit had been utterly and completely desecrated, feeling a powerlessness so vast and so deep it was a universe unto itself. The rune stone in her palm, still holding the phantom warmth of Astrid's hand, was not a promise of new beginnings. It was a tombstone. Weeks crawled by, each dawn breaking over a fjord that was a stranger to itself. The air, once filled with the scent of pine and sea and the distant hum of the grove's life, now seemed thinner, emptier. Jarl Einar, emboldened by his demonstration of loyalty to the new god, had wasted no time in cementing his new order. A decree was issued, read aloud in the marketplace by a nervous huskarl while Brother Thaddeus stood behind him, a black-robed specter of authority. All tithes that once went to the spirits of the land, the offerings left at the base of ancient stones or tossed into the fjord for a good catch, were now to be rendered unto the church. All souls were to present themselves for Brother Thaddeus's sermons at the raw, hastily built wooden structure that now squatted where a meadow of wildflowers used to grow. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and foreign piety. Runa remained in her longhouse on the outskirts of the village, a self-imposed exile. The scent of her own herbs, yarrow for courage, chamomile for calm, did little to soothe the disquiet in her soul. From her doorway she watched the slow, painful fracturing of her community. She saw the fear in their eyes, the way they walked with their shoulders hunched, their gazes lowered. These were her people. She had blessed their births, mended their wounds, guided their spirits through the turning of the seasons. Now they shuffled past her longhouse with averted eyes, a new kind of fear warring with an old, ingrained respect. They feared the Jarl's swords, the grim finality of his justice. And they feared the new god, a being who demanded not quiet respect but loud, public submission, whose priest spoke of hellfire and damnation with a terrifying relish. Runa felt a despair so profound it was like being buried alive. Her grief for Astrid and the grove was a constant, physical ache, but this was different. This was the agony of watching a living thing die a slow, lingering death. The old ways were not just rituals and runes, they were the rhythm of the people's lives, the language of their souls. And now they were being starved, silenced, and replaced. Her own inaction felt like a betrayal. What were the spirits of the land against the sharp edges of a Jarl's authority? What was whispered wisdom against shouted dogma? She felt adrift, her ancient power useless in this new, brutal landscape. The turning point did not arrive with a crash of thunder or a portentous dream. It came with a soft, desperate knock on her door long after the moon had risen. It was Alara, a young mother from the village. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide with a terror Runa knew all too well. Runa had healed Alara's son, a small, frail boy named Finn, from a lung sickness the previous winter, using a poultice of old man's beard and a chant to coax the fever out. "He is sick again, Runa," Alara whispered, her words tumbling out in a rush. She clutched a small, woven pouch in her hands. "The fever returned this evening. He burns with it. I went to the church first. Brother Thaddeus laid his hands on him. He spoke in his foreign tongue, but the fever only grew worse. I know you can help him. I know you can." She pushed the pouch into Runa's hands. It was a pittance, a few dried apples, a lump of honeycomb, an offering. But as Runa took it, Alara flinched back, casting a terrified glance over her shoulder toward the silent village. "No one saw me come," she said, her voice dropping to a near-inaudible whisper. "I swear it. The Jarl, he said anyone seeking your aid would be cleansed." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and sterile, cleansed, like filth. In that moment, standing in her doorway with the scent of pine and fear clinging to the night air, Runa understood. The old ways would not die in a single, glorious blaze like the grove. They would die in 1,000 quiet moments of fear just like this one. They would be extinguished in the hearts of mothers too terrified to seek the healing they trusted, in the silence of fishermen who no longer dared to ask for Njord's blessing. Her inaction, born of grief and powerlessness, was a death sentence for her entire culture. A cold, hard resolve began to form in the hollow space where her spirit had been. It was not the warm, life-affirming power of the grove. It was something else, something colder, sharper. If she could not fight their swords with spirits, then she would have to learn a new kind of magic, the magic of the mind, the magic of secrets and whispers, the magic of politics. She would have to stop thinking like a Völva and start thinking like them. She took Alara by the arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "Bring Finn to me," she said, her voice low but clear, stripped of its earlier despair. "Use the path through the woods behind the longhouse, and fear not. The spirits of this place are not so easily silenced." After she had tended to the boy, grinding herbs and whispering the old chants until his breathing eased and the fire in his skin subsided, Runa went to her stores. Her mind was a whirlwind of ancient knowledge, but she was not seeking a cure for sickness. She was seeking a weapon. She remembered the tales of the berserkers, of the mushrooms they would eat to fuel their ecstatic rage. But she didn't want rage. She wanted doubt. She wanted fear. She found what she was looking for. A small, unassuming mushroom with a mottled cap, one that grew only in the damp, shaded earth near the fjord's oldest burial mounds. Harmless in small doses, a simple seasoning for stews. But in a slightly larger quantity, prepared in a particular way, it opened the mind to things unseen, to visions. Her first act of war was silent and subtle. Under the cloak of the new moon, one of the few elderly men still loyal to her, a man whose family she had guided for 3 generations, crept to the well near the newly built church. The well used by Thaddeus and his most fervent, newly converted guards and acolytes. He carried a small, sealed clay pot. The contents were odorless, colorless, a concentrated liquid Runa had spent 2 days preparing. The pot was unsealed, and its contents emptied into the deep, cold water. The following sermon was, by all accounts, a spectacle. As Brother Thaddeus stood before his congregation, his voice rising in a crescendo of damnation and fire, a strange thing began to happen. One of the Jarl's men, a warrior known for his boorish piety, suddenly screamed. He pointed a trembling finger at the simple wooden cross behind Thaddeus, his eyes wide with terror. "The serpent," he bellowed. "It's coiled around the cross, its eyes they burn." A moment later, one of the women in the front row, a woman who had been the first to trade her Mjolnir amulet for a wooden cross, began to sob uncontrollably. She clawed at her own face, babbling about shadowy figures with antlers creeping between the pews, their whispers promising a return to the earth. 2 more followed, crying out at visions only they could see, the walls of the church seeming to bleed, the face of Thaddeus melting like wax, the floor writhing with roots and worms. Thaddeus was furious, his sermon dissolving into a chaotic scene of panic and confusion. He declared it a test from his god, a demonic assault on the faithful. But Runa, watching from the tree line far beyond the church, knew the truth. She had not created a grand omen. She had simply brewed a cup of tea. She had planted a seed, not a seed of faith, but a seed of doubt, a seed of fear. And as she watched the chaos unfold, she felt the first, cold glimmer of a new and terrible kind of power. She was no longer a victim. She was a strategist. Now here's where I have to pause for a second, because this is the moment everything changes for Runa. She's moving from a place of pure spiritual power to something much more dangerous, and let's be honest, much more human. She's decided to fight fire with fire, or in this case, visions with visions. She's using their own certainty against them. It's a huge risk. She's stepping away from the sacred traditions that defined her and into the murky world of manipulation. Is it still a righteous path if you have to use poison to walk it? I think that's the question she's starting to ask herself, and it's a question that's going to follow her all the way to the end. Her campaign of whispers and shadows began in earnest. Runa, who had once communed with the unseen world through ritual and trance, now communed with the fears of her people. She became a master of psychological theater, her stage the entire fjord. She didn't need grand gestures, just the right word whispered in the right ear, the right object placed in the right spot. She enlisted the forgotten ones, the old women who still mumbled the names of the Norns while weaving, the trappers who knew the forest's secrets, the fishermen who felt the old gods and the pull of the tides. They became her invisible army. She used her deep knowledge of nature, the very source of her old power, and twisted it into a new shape. A flock of ravens, Odin's messengers, was lured by carefully placed offal to circle over the Jarl's longhouse for 3 days straight. To the Christians, it was a nuisance. To anyone with a drop of the old blood, it was a chilling omen. Whispers, seeded by Runa's agents, began to circulate of Draugr, the restless dead, being sighted near the church grounds at night. It wasn't hard to make believe. A bit of phosphorescent fungus smeared on a standing stone, a mournful cry mimicked by a boy hidden in the trees. It was enough to ignite the old, deep-seated fears that Thaddeus's sermons couldn't erase. The effect was palpable. Attendance at the new church, which had been full to bursting after the burning of the grove, began to dwindle. People made excuses. A mending of nets, a sick child, a pre-dawn hunt that left them too weary for prayer. The tithes of grain and silver became smaller. Jarl Einar felt the shift. It wasn't open rebellion, it was quieter, a subtle erosion of the iron-fisted control he thought he had secured. His authority was being challenged not by swords, but by superstition. Feeling the ground soften beneath his feet, he put pressure on the source of his new legitimacy. He went to brother Thaddeus. "Your god is silent while this Völva's demons whisper in every shadow." Einar's voice, overheard by a servant who reported it to one of Runa's contacts, was laced with frustration. "The people are afraid. Their fear is making them useless. You promised me a new era of order, of strength. Instead, I have a village of frightened children seeing ghosts. I need a sign, a real one, something to crush this pagan nonsense for good." Thaddeus, whose own frustration was mounting, saw an opportunity not just to placate the Jarl, but to solidify his own dominion. He needed a miracle, and the sky, it seemed, was about to provide one. A storm rolled in from the north, a monster of wind and water that churned the fjord into a gray, frothing cauldron. The fishing fleet, caught unawares, was trapped outside the mouth of the fjord, unable to navigate the treacherous channel back to the safety of the village. The entrance was guarded by a notorious rock formation, a jagged spire of stone known as the Widow's Tooth, which created deadly currents in rough weather. The entire village gathered on the cliffs, their faces lashed by rain, watching the small, bobbing ships that held their fathers, husbands, and sons. This was the moment Thaddeus had been waiting for. Seizing his chance, he strode to the edge of the cliff, his black robes whipping around him like ragged wings. He raised his hands to the tumultuous sky, his voice booming over the howl of the wind. He prayed, not with the quiet reverence of the old ways, but with a loud, demanding fury. He commanded the storm to heal, commanded the sea to yield, commanded his God to show his power before these wavering heathens. The crowd watched, a mixture of terror and desperate hope on their faces. Runa was there, standing at the back, her heart a cold knot in her chest. This was a battle of faith playing out on the grandest possible stage, and she had no move to make. As the storm reached its roaring peak, a bolt of lightning, impossibly bright, split the sky. It jagged downward, striking not the sea, not the cliff, but the very tip of the Widow's Tooth. There was a deafening crack, a sound like the world breaking in two. The ancient rock formation, a feature of the fjord for as long as anyone could remember, shuddered. Great fissures appeared, and with a groaning roar that was swallowed by the storm, the entire spire crumbled and collapsed into the waves. The channel, the path home, was suddenly, miraculously clear. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by a wave of awestruck shouts. The fishing boats, guided by the now unobstructed channel, began to make their way into the harbor. It was a miracle, a direct, undeniable answer to the priest's prayer. The people fell to their knees in the mud and rain. They looked at Thaddeus not just as a priest, but as a holy man, a man who could command the very elements. They turned to look at Runa, who stood alone, drenched and silent. Their faces, which hours before had held a flicker of the old belief, were now filled with a new and fervent conviction, tinged with accusation. She was a charlatan. Her whispers were just that, whispers. Thaddeus's God answered with lightning and thunder. What they didn't see, what they couldn't know, was the conversation that had happened 2 days prior. Einar, a practical man despite his new piety, had been complaining to his chief stonemason about the Widow's Tooth. "That rock has claimed too many ships," he'd grumbled. The mason, a man who knew the fjord's geology better than his own wife's face, had replied, "It won't for much longer, Jarl. The last winter's frost split its base. I've seen the cracks. A good storm, a solid wave. It's a matter of time, before it comes down on its own." Thaddeus hadn't performed a miracle. Einar, in his frustration, had mentioned the rock's instability to his priest, complaining that even the geology of the fjord was conspiring against him. Thaddeus, a shrewd opportunist cloaked in zeal, had simply made an educated, high-stakes guess. He had gambled on the storm, and the sky had paid his wager. Runa watched as the villagers crowded around Thaddeus, their faces shining with adoration. All her careful work, all the seeds of doubt she had planted, were washed away in this single, spectacular moment. She was worse than powerless now. She was a mockery, a spiteful old crone whose petty tricks had been exposed by a blaze of divine power. Thaddeus was no longer just a priest, he was a prophet. The Jarl had his sign, and Runa was at her lowest point, completely and utterly defeated. The path she had chosen, the dark, winding path of manipulation, had led her straight into a wall of unshakable, miraculous faith. Publicly disgraced, Runa retreated once more into the shadows of her longhouse. The miracle at the harbor had undone all her work, cementing Brother Thaddeus's power in a way she could have never anticipated. The village was buzzing with talk of the new god's might. Her omens were forgotten, dismissed as the sour grapes of a powerless old woman. She looked at her hands that could mix herbs to heal a child or guide a soul to the next world, and they felt useless. The people didn't want whispers anymore, they wanted thunder. They wanted miracles they could see with their own eyes. She realized then that she could not win a war of spectacle. Thaddeus would always be better at it. His religion was built on it. A public battle of faith would only lead to her own destruction. She needed a new strategy. She needed an insider. Her thoughts turned, unexpectedly, to the Jarl's own longhouse, to the one person who stood at the center of this new web of power, yet was not truly a part of it. Sigrid, Jarl Einar's wife. Runa remembered Sigrid as a young girl, brought from a neighboring fjord for the marriage alliance. She had been raised in a family that still honored the old ways, quietly but fiercely. Runa recalled seeing the girl, just after her arrival, leaving a small offering of wildflowers at a spring sacred to Freya. And she knew, through the quiet intelligence network she still maintained, that Sigrid still wore a small, silver Mjolnir amulet, hidden on a chain beneath the fine wool of her Christian-style gowns. It was a secret act of defiance, a quiet rebellion of the heart. Getting a message to the Jarl's wife was a risk. Her longhouse was now the center of the new power, closely watched by Thaddeus's acolytes. But risk was all Runa had left. She tasked the old trapper, the one man who could move through the fjord's landscape like a ghost, to deliver a single, unmarked raven's feather to Sigrid's personal servant, a woman whose loyalty, Runa gambled, was to her mistress, not her mistress's husband. The feather was a signal, an old code between women of the old ways. It meant a secret meeting, a matter of the spirit. Days later, under the pretense of gathering late-season berries on the wooded hill behind the village, the two women met. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves a riot of gold and red around them. Sigrid was nervous, her eyes constantly scanning the trees. She was a handsome woman, strong and proud, but Runa could see the strain around her eyes, the tight line of her jaw. "This is madness, Runa," Sigrid began, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "If we are seen." Runa did not begin with threats or accusations. She didn't speak of revenge for the Grove or for Astrid. She understood that Sigrid, whatever her private beliefs, was bound by duty and perhaps even affection to Einar. To attack the Jarl would be to attack his wife. Instead, Runa spoke of balance. "I am not here to ask you to defy your husband," Runa said, her voice calm and even, the voice of the Völva she used to be. "I am here to help you save him." Sigrid's eyes, cautious and wary, narrowed slightly. "Save him from what? He is more powerful than ever." "Is he?" Runa countered softly. "Or is he a branch in a high wind about to snap? Look at him, Sigrid. Look at what he is becoming in his quest for this new power. He was always ambitious, but he was also rooted in this land and its people. Now, he is a puppet of a foreign priest and a distant king. Thaddeus feeds his ambition, yes, but he also feeds him poison. He tells Einar that mercy is weakness, that tradition is heresy, that his own people are a flock of ignorant sheep to be herded with a rod of iron." Runa took a step closer, her gaze intense. She didn't channel a vision, she painted one with words. "I see a future for this fjord, Sigrid. A future where Einar, in his zeal to prove his loyalty, becomes so brittle that he shatters. He will alienate the very warriors who keep him in power. He will lose the respect of the elders whose wisdom he now scorns. He is isolating himself, wrapping himself in the cold robes of Thaddeus's faith until he is a stranger in his own hall. And when he is no longer useful to the southern king, when his people finally turn on him because he has become a tyrant, what then? Thaddeus will abandon him and find a new Jarl to whisper to. He will be left with nothing." Runa could see her words finding their mark. Sigrid loved her husband, not just as a political necessity, but as the man she had built a life with. And she feared the stranger he was becoming, the coldness in his eyes when he returned from his meetings with the priest. "What would you have me do?" Sigrid asked, her voice barely audible. The question was a concession, a crack in the wall of her fear. This was the critical moment. The plan shifted. Runa moved from a reactive campaign of omens to a proactive strategy of political undeclining. This was no longer about discrediting Thaddeus's god. That was a losing battle. This was about using the very tools of her enemies against them. She would use Thaddeus's own fanatical fervor and Einar's consuming ambition to engineer their mutual downfall. "I need to know what they speak of in the Jarl's hall," Runa explained, her voice low and precise. "I need to know Einar's plans, his worries. I need to know about any envoys or delegations he is expecting. Thaddeus believes his power comes from his god. Einar believes his comes from his new alliances. I will show them that their true power, the power that will destroy them, comes from within. It is their own nature." Sigrid was silent for a long moment, the dappled sunlight playing across her troubled face. This was a deeper betrayal than placing a flower at an old spring. This was active conspiracy. But she thought of the man Einar had been, the laughter that no longer reached his eyes. She thought of the future Runa had painted, a future that felt terrifyingly plausible. "He is expecting a delegation from the Southern King," Sigrid said finally, her voice resolute. "In 2 moons' time, they are coming to assess his rule to see if the fjord has been properly civilized. Einar is desperate to impress them." A cold, grim smile touched Runa's lips for the first time in months. A delegation, a deadline, an audience, it was perfect. "Then we have 2 moons to set the stage for the final act," Runa said. The alliance was forged, an unexpected, dangerous pact made in the dappled sunlight of an autumn afternoon. Sigrid, the Jarl's wife, would be Runa's eyes and ears inside the fortress of power. Runa, the disgraced Völva, would be the mind weaving a new fate for them all. She had found her insider. She had found her path. Runa walked back to her longhouse not as a victim of the plot that had destroyed her life, but as the author of a new one. The theme of spiritual integrity versus practical necessity had been a battle in her soul, and for now, necessity had won. She had traded the purity of the grove for the grime of conspiracy, and in doing so, had found her first real taste of hope. Have you ever been in a situation where the only way forward is to become something you never thought you'd be? Runa was a spiritual guide. Her entire life was about communion with nature, about healing, about wisdom. But to save the very culture that gave her that identity, she has to become a political operative. She's forming secret alliances, planning to manipulate courts and kings. It's a profound sacrifice, not just of her safety, but of her own self-image. She's trading her spiritual integrity for a chance at survival. It's a dark and complicated path, and it makes you wonder. When your back is against the wall, what part of yourself are you willing to sacrifice to win? It's a question without an easy answer, and Runa is living it every single day. With Sigrid's information flowing like a secret stream into Runa's quiet longhouse, the strategy sharpened. The amorphous goal of sowing doubt now had a clear and finite objective: the delegation from the Southern King. Einar's desperation to present a pious, stable, and modern fjord was the weakness Runa would exploit. Her new strategy focused on a single point of failure: the fragile alliance between the politically ambitious Jarl and the fanatically religious priest. She would drive a wedge between them, using their own natures as the hammer. Through Sigrid, Runa began her work. Her whispers were now far more precise. To Einar, Sigrid would subtly plant seeds of doubt about his partner in faith. She would recount, with feigned innocence, stories she had overheard from traders about the refined courts of the South. "They say the king's own priests are learned men, scholars," she might mention to Einar over the evening meal, as she mended a tear in his tunic. "They speak of diplomacy and scripture, of building alliances through grace and wisdom. They say that loud, fiery sermons are seen as provincial, the mark of an unsophisticated land still clinging to barbarism." She would never mention Thaddeus by name, but the implication was clear. She was stroking Einar's pride, while simultaneously framing his greatest spiritual asset as a political liability. Einar, desperate to be seen as an equal by the Southerners, began to look at Thaddeus's public displays of zealotry with a newly critical eye. Simultaneously, Runa used her other channels, the trappers and fishermen who moved in and out of the village unnoticed, to feed Thaddeus's paranoia. Whispers reached the priest's acolytes that Jarl Einar was a weak-willed politician, a man of convenience, not true faith, that he had been heard privately questioning the methods of the church. "He's a weather vane," one rumor went, "pointing whichever way the royal wind blows. If the king's delegation finds your priest too fervent, the Jarl will cast him aside like a worn-out shoe." The pressure mounted on both men. Einar began to see Thaddeus not as his key to power, but as a potential source of humiliation before the king's envoys. Thaddeus, in turn, started to view Einar not as his patron, but as a potential betrayer, a man whose faith was only as deep as his political needs. Their conversations became shorter, more strained. The easy alliance they once shared was now curdling with suspicion. Runa's trap, baited with pride and paranoia, was slowly closing. The plan was working perfectly. Too perfectly. Disaster arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper in the wrong place. Sigrid, grown more confident in her role, had arranged a clandestine meeting with one of Runa's contacts, the elderly weaver, to pass along a new piece of information: the exact date of the delegation's arrival. Their exchange was brief, a few coded words about a pattern for a new tapestry, but it was not unheard. A serving girl, a young, devout follower of Brother Thaddeus, had been in the storehouse gathering herbs. She was a girl who had been among those who had the visions after drinking from the well, but Thaddeus had convinced her it was a demonic attack and that her piety had saved her. Her loyalty was now absolute. She heard the coded words: "The falcon arrives on the next full moon," a reference to the king's sigil, and while she didn't understand their full meaning, she knew the conversation was secret. She recognized the weaver as one of the old crones who still clung to the pagan ways. Her suspicion piqued. She ran not to the Jarl, but to the priest. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Thaddeus, his mind already primed with Runa's manufactured paranoia about Einar's weak will, saw this not as simple treason, but as a satanic conspiracy reaching into the Jarl's own bed. He saw Sigrid, with her hidden Emjolnir and her quiet dignity, as the serpent in the garden. He went to Einar, not with suspicion, but with righteous, damning fury. The scene in the Jarl's hall was an inferno. Thaddeus, holding the terrified serving girl as his witness, accused Sigrid of being an agent of the Völva, a secret pagan plotting to undermine the work of God himself. For Einar, the accusation was the ultimate humiliation. His wife, his own household. It confirmed every whispered doubt Sigrid had so carefully planted in his mind about his own control. To be betrayed by his own wife suggested he was not the master of his domain. In the face of Thaddeus's righteous tirade, and with the delegation's arrival looming, Einar's political ambition and his wounded pride fused into a single explosive reaction. He did not see his wife, the woman he had shared a life with. He saw a political disaster, a symbol of his own weakness. "Is it true?" he roared at Sigrid, his face a mask of fury. "Have you been conspiring with that witch?" Sigrid, pale but resolute, met his gaze. "I have conspired only to save this fjord from tearing itself apart," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "To save you from becoming a man I no longer recognize." Her defiance, her failure to cower and beg for forgiveness, was the final straw. It was an admission of guilt in his eyes. Enraged and utterly humiliated by his wife's perceived betrayal, Einar had her seized by his guards. "She will be confined to her chambers until the delegation leaves," he snarled. "I will not have my authority questioned in my own hall." But for Thaddeus, confinement was not enough. His own power base felt threatened. If the Jarl's wife could defy God, then anyone could. This was his chance to assert his authority not just over the people, but over the Jarl himself. "Confinement is a courtesy, not a purification," Thaddeus thundered, his eyes blazing. "This is a spiritual rot, Jarl Einar. It must be burned out. I demand a public trial. A purification by ordeal for your wife to prove to the people and to our Lord that no one is above judgment. We will let God himself decide her guilt." All of Runa's carefully laid plans were in ruins. Her one and only ally, the key to her entire strategy, was now a captive. Worse, Sigrid's life was on a knife's edge, her fate to be decided by a barbaric trial designed to prove the very power Runa sought to undermine. The trap she had set for Einar and Thaddeus had instead sprung on Sigrid, and the path to victory had vanished, replaced by a direct path to her friend's execution. Runa was not just back where she started. She was in a far worse place, responsible for the imminent demise of the one person who had dared to help her. The news of Sigrid's imprisonment and her impending trial by ordeal struck Runa like a physical blow. The fjord, already cold, seemed to freeze around her. The full moon, once a beacon of the delegation's arrival and a deadline for her plan, was now a death sentence for her only ally. Jarl Einar, in his rage and humiliation, had ceded moral authority to Thaddeus. The priest, high on his victory, was preparing a grand public spectacle of judgment that would cement his power forever. Runa was out of time, out of allies, and out of options. Almost. This was her darkest moment. The path of subtle manipulation was gone. The whispers and shadows were useless against the public pronouncement of a trial by ordeal. To save Sigrid, to salvage anything from the wreckage of her plans, Runa would have to do something she had sworn she would never do. She had to step out of the shadows and back into the light, but not as a healer or a guide. She had to become the monster they accused her of being. She had to fully embrace the manipulative arts she had been so cautiously wielding, and in doing so, sacrifice the last vestiges of her own revered identity. Her moral dilemma was stark. To save Sigrid, she had to risk becoming unrecognizable to herself. She had to trade her spiritual integrity not for practical necessity, but for a desperate final gambit. She decided to weave a great prophecy. Not a subtle omen like the ravens, not a manufactured one like the Churchwell visions, but a true and terrible prophecy, spoken with the full and terrifying weight of her station. It would be a prediction of doom so specific, so potent, that it could not be ignored. It would be a weapon aimed at the hearts of both her enemies, designed to be catastrophically misinterpreted. The prophecy would foretell a great and terrible cleansing that would occur upon the delegation's arrival. For Thaddeus, a man primed by his own ego and fervor, the prophecy would sound like a divine promise of his own moment of triumph, a sign that God would grant him a great and terrible judgment. For Einar, a man consumed by political anxiety, the same words would sound like a prediction of political disaster, a bloody purge that would horrify the sophisticated Southerners and destroy his reputation. The beauty of the trap was that the prophecy's words would be identical for both. Only their interpretations would differ, driven by their own deepest desires and fears. But for such a prophecy to have power, it could not be whispered. It had to be delivered. It required a ritual so profound and so public that it would burn itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. It required a true Sather. To do this, Runa knew she would be sacrificing her own reputation forever. In the eyes of the Christians, including the moderate ones who were simply afraid, performing a full, ecstatic Sather ritual would make her appear completely and utterly demonic, unhinged, a frothing madwoman communing with devils. But to the few who still remembered the old ways, to the ones whose hearts still held a flicker of the old fire, it would be seen as an act of immense power and desperate sacrifice. She would be immolating her image as a wise woman to save the fjord's future. She began her preparations. For 3 days, she fasted, purifying her body and honing her mind to a razor's edge. She gathered the old herbs, the ones she hadn't touched since before the burning of the grove, henbane and nightshade, herbs of vision and death. On the 3rd night, the night before the full moon and the delegation's scheduled arrival, she walked to the highest, most wind-swept cliff overlooking the fjord, the very same cliff where Thaddeus had claimed his miracle. She built a small fire, its smoke a lonely plume against the starry sky. Her remaining loyalists, the old weaver and the silent trapper, had spread the word. The Völva will speak. A small, fearful crowd gathered at a distance, drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a deep, buried need to see something other than Thaddeus's rigid certainty. Runa began. She drank the herbal concoction, its bitterness a familiar fire in her throat. She began to chant, her voice at first a low hum, then rising into the ancient guttural cadences of the Sather song. Her body began to sway, then to tremble, caught in the ecstatic, violent throes of the trance. To the onlookers, it was terrifying. Her eyes rolled back in her head, her limbs thrashed, and foam flecked her lips. She was no longer the dignified, wise Runa. She was a primal force, a vessel for something wild and untamed. And then she spoke. Her voice was no longer her own. It was a rasp, a groan, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I see them," she shrieked, her voice echoing across the cliffside. "The falcon men arrive with the dawn. They seek a land of order, a land of peace." She paused, her body convulsing. "But the one god is hungry. He demands a cleansing, a sign to prove his dominion. In the Jarl's hall, where treaties are made, a servant of God, blinded by his own light, will demand a river of fire. He will call for a purge of the unbelievers to sanctify the holy ground. He will turn the feast of welcome into a trial of blood. The Jarl's ambition and the priest's faith shall become a single, devouring flame. Their pact will be their pyre. The falcon men will see the truth not in piety, but in the madness of the purge, and they will flee from this land of fanatics. The cleansing comes. The cleansing comes for them all." She collapsed then, falling to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The crowd was silent, paralyzed by what they had witnessed. Thaddeus's followers saw the devil's work. Einar's men saw a madwoman's ravings. But Runa knew her words, carried on the night wind, would reach the two men they were intended for. They would reach Thaddeus, who would hear a divine premonition of his greatest moment. A confirmation that he was meant to perform a great, fiery cleansing to impress the delegation with his godly power. And they would reach Einar, who would hear a terrifying prediction of political ruin, that his fanatical priest was about to go mad and commit an atrocity in front of the very people he needed to impress. Runa lay on the cold stone, her body aching, her spirit scraped raw. She had sacrificed her name, her dignity, her sacred art. She had made herself a monster in the eyes of many, but the loom of fate had been rethreaded. The final, desperate trap was set. All she could do now was wait for the dawn and for her prophecy to unravel them all. The morning of the delegation's arrival broke cold and clear. A pristine sky arched over a fjord simmering with tension. Jarl Einar, his face a mask of strained hospitality, had been in a state of barely controlled panic since hearing of Runa's prophecy. The Völva's words echoed his own deepest fears about Thaddeus's fanaticism. He had ordered the priest to remain in his church, to keep his zealotry contained until after the envoys were gone. But Thaddeus, who had heard the same prophecy as a divine command, felt a holy fire in his veins. He believed he was chosen for a great work this day, and he would not be silenced by a weak-willed Jarl. The king's delegation arrived as prophesied, their longship, with its falcon-emblazoned sail, a sleek and sophisticated marvel compared to the fjord's more rugged vessels. The envoys themselves were men of the southern court, clad in fine wool, their hair and beards neatly trimmed. They were diplomats and administrators, not warriors, and their eyes scanned the raw, harsh landscape of the fjord with a mixture of curiosity and faint disdain. Jarl Einar, desperate to project an image of a stable, pious, and modern rule, had prepared a great feast in his hall. The finest ale, roasted boar, and stacks of bread filled the long tables. He greeted the head envoy, a stern but polite man named Lord Osbert, with a forced smile, his words of welcome just a little too loud, a little too eager. "This is it. The climax is here. Runa has set all the pieces on the board. Everything that happens next is a chain reaction she meticulously engineered. This is what I call a masterpiece of reverse engineering. She isn't attacking them. She's created a situation where their own personalities, their own fatal flaws, Einar's ambition and Thaddeus's fanaticism, will become the weapons of their own destruction. It's not about magic anymore, it's about psychology, and it is absolutely brilliant." The first domino fell quietly. While the Jarl and his guests settled at the high table, one of Runa's loyalists, an old man who had served in the hall for decades and was thus invisible, made his move. Weeks earlier, Runa had given him a small, crudely carved wooden figurine, an old totem of a forgotten fertility god. Following her instructions, the old servant had hidden it deep within the church's store of communion wine. Now, at the height of the commotion of preparing the feast, the servant discovered it. He feigned horror, bringing the discovery not to the Jarl, but directly to brother Thaddeus's second-in-command, a young priest as zealous as his master. The news ripped through the church. A pagan idol, not just in the village, but inside the holy sanctuary itself, tainting the sacred wine. The implication was immediate and damning. Brother Thaddeus, for all his fire and fury, was incompetent. He couldn't even keep his own church pure. The news reached Thaddeus just as he was chafing under Einar's order to remain quiet. This was the final proof he needed. The demonic presence Runa had prophesied was real, and it had infiltrated his own holy ground. His carefully constructed paranoia, fed by Runa's whispers for weeks, now exploded. This wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war by the forces of darkness. And Runa's prophecy had told him exactly how to respond, with a great, fiery cleansing. He saw the discovery of the idol not as the trap it was, but as the divine signal he had been waiting for. This was his moment. He stormed out of the church, his face a mask of righteous fury, and marched directly toward the Jarl's hall, his most fervent acolytes trailing behind him like a dark tide. Inside the hall, the feast was underway. Lord Osbert was politely questioning Jarl Einar about his methods for converting the local population, his tone clinical and detached. Einar was sweating, trying to paint a picture of peaceful, voluntary conversion. It was at that precise moment that the main doors to the hall were thrown open with a crash. Brother Thaddeus stood there, framed in the doorway, his eyes wild. He looked like a specter of death. "An abomination!" he shrieked, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent hall. He strode forward, pointing a trembling finger at Einar. "While you feast with these soft southerners, the enemy digs its roots into the very foundation of this house of God. I told you this land needed a true cleansing." Einar leaped to his feet, his face draining of all color. "Thaddeus, I commanded you to." "Your commands are meaningless," Thaddeus retorted, his voice rising to a fever pitch. He was no longer speaking to Einar, but to the heavens, to the horrified envoys, to everyone. "The Völva prophesied it. A great cleansing is upon us. It is the will of God. We must purge the unbelievers from our midst. Now, before this holy ground is lost forever." The southern delegates stared, their polite smiles frozen on their faces. They were looking at Thaddeus as if he were a wild animal that had just wandered into their court. This was the provincial fanaticism Sigrid had warned Einar about, brought to horrifying life. Thaddeus, completely blinded by his own zealous interpretation of the prophecy, then made his final, fatal move. "The rot starts at the head," he screamed, turning his accusing finger on Sigrid, who was seated at the high table, pale and silent. "With the pagan in your own bed, the prophecy demands it. The ordeal for the witch must happen now. We will have a purification by fire here in this hall as a sign of true faith for all to see." He was using Einar's ambition against him, declaring that only this total, zealous, and public cleansing would satisfy God, and by extension, the king. He was using his own faith against himself, misinterpreting his own panic and paranoia as divine instruction from on high. But for Jarl Einar, the spell was broken. In that single, horrifying moment, he saw everything with crystal clarity. He didn't see a man of God. He saw a madman. He saw the disgusted, horrified looks on the faces of Lord Osbert and the other delegates. He saw his years of planning, his careful alliances, his entire political future crumbling into dust before his eyes. This wild missionary, this blunt instrument he had used to seize power, had just become his single greatest liability. Thaddeus wasn't his path to the new world. He was a gate back to the barbarism Einar was so desperate to escape. With a snarl of pure fury, Einar made his choice. He chose his ambition over his faith. "You are insane," he spat at Thaddeus, his voice low and shaking with rage. He turned to the delegates, attempting to salvage the unsalvageable. "My lords, I apologize for this unfortunate display. This man's fervor has clearly overtaken his reason." It was a public denunciation. The alliance, the very bedrock of their power, shattered right there, in the middle of the hall, for everyone to see. Thaddeus stared at Einar, his fanatical certainty finally cracking, replaced by the stunned look of a true believer who has just been betrayed. You faithless heathen," Thaddeus whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. Then his whisper turned into a roar of fury. "You would side with these perfumed idolaters over the messenger of God? You are the one who is corrupt. You are the one who is unclean." The two men, who together had burned down Runa's world, were now at each other's throats. Their accusations flew, each man exposing the other's weaknesses. Einar's political maneuvering was laid bare by Thaddeus, while Thaddeus's dangerous fanaticism was condemned by Einar. It was a spectacular public implosion. The very tools they had used to grasp power, Einar's ambition, Thaddeus's faith, had become the instruments of their mutual and magnificent destruction. Runa's prophecy was fulfilled not by any supernatural force, but by the predictable, flawed nature of the men themselves. She had not predicted their doom. She had simply authored it, using their own hands to write the final chapter. The aftermath of the disastrous feast was swift and decisive. Lord Osbert and the king's envoys needed no more evidence. They had come seeking a stable, predictable vassal and had instead found a chaotic hive of fanaticism and infighting. Their report to the king was scathing. Jarl Einar was deemed an incapable leader, a man unable to control his own court, let alone an entire strategic fjord. He was not a partner for progress. He was a liability. Within a month, he was formally stripped of his title. The southern king, who valued order above all else, replaced him with a younger, more moderate Jarl from a neighboring region, a man known for his pragmatism, not his piety. Einar, the man who had dreamed of a seat at the table of power, was reduced to a landless exile, his ambition a burned-out husk. Brother Thaddeus's fate was just as ignominious. Recalled in disgrace by his own church superiors, his brand of fiery, disruptive zealotry was deemed counterproductive to the church's long-term goals of steady, quiet conversion. He was sent to a remote, frozen monastery in the far north, a place where his fire could melt no more than the winter snows. His crusade was over. The great power of his god, which had answered with lightning, had ultimately been silenced by politics. In the ensuing shift of power, Sigrid was quietly freed. No ordeal was ever spoken of again. The new Jarl, valuing her knowledge of the fjord and its people, and seeing the respect she quietly commanded, elevated her to the status of a respected elder in his new court. She became a voice of moderation and tradition, a quiet but firm force ensuring a new era of tolerance. She never wore her Mjolnir amulet openly, but she no longer had to hide it either. And Runa did not reclaim her grove. She never tried. The blackened stumps of the ancient ash trees remained, a permanent, silent scar on the landscape, a reminder of what was lost. Her victory was not in the restoration of the past. It couldn't be. The world had changed, and she had changed with it. She did not seek a position of power in the new Jarl's court. Her name was still whispered with fear by some, with awe by others. In the end, she had become a legend, something more and less than human. Her true victory, the real resolution of her long and painful journey, was quieter. It was a victory of resilience, not revenge. The final scene of her story is not one of triumph, but of transmission. Months later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the peaks of the fjord, Runa could be found not in a ceremonial circle or a hall of power, but sitting by the hearth in her simple longhouse. A small group of children were gathered at her feet, their faces upturned and glowing in the firelight. Among them was Finn, Alera's son, now healthy and bright-eyed. She was not teaching them the grand, ecstatic rituals of the Sather. She was not training a new apprentice to replace Astrid. The time for that was over. Instead, she was doing something far more fundamental. She was telling them the old stories. The stories of Thor and his hammer, of Loki and his tricks, of the weaving of the Norns. With a small knife, she would take a piece of birch bark and carve the runes, explaining their meanings not as tools of magic, but as symbols of life. Effehu, for the cattle in the field and the wealth of a good heart. Uras, for the strength of the wild ox and the strength to endure a hard winter. The old ways were no longer a formal religion, a power to rival the new church. They couldn't be, but they were surviving. They were surviving as cultural wisdom, as folklore, as a language of the soul woven so deeply into the fabric of the community's heart that no foreign god could ever truly erase it. Runa's revenge was never truly about destroying Einar and Thaddeus. That was merely the means. Her true, therapeutic journey was about ensuring the survival of her people's spirit. She had lost her home. She had lost her apprentice. She had lost a piece of her own spiritual innocence in the dark arts of manipulation she was forced to learn. But she had succeeded in a way that went beyond mere vengeance. She had saved the roots of her culture, not by protecting the great tree, but by planting its seeds in the minds of the next generation, allowing them to grow again in a new and different world. Her victory wasn't a roar of thunder. It was the quiet, enduring whisper of the grove, carried on the wind for those who still knew how to listen. And so, Runa's story comes to a close. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That sometimes the greatest victory isn't about rebuilding what was torn down, but about planting something new in the ruins. She found her peace not in retribution, but in resilience. She ensured that the spirit of her people, the very thing her enemies tried to extinguish, would live on, just in a different form. She moved from a victim of circumstance to the quiet author of her culture's future. That, right there, is the very essence of growth. It's what can happen when the overwhelming need for revenge cools, and what's left is a deeper desire to heal and to build. I find her story incredibly moving. It makes me think about what victory really means. What would you have done in her place? Would you have sought a more direct, more personal revenge? Or would you have played the long game like she did? I always love to hear your thoughts, so let me know in the comments below. Every story, every perspective, helps us all understand this complex journey a little bit better. Thank you for joining me here on Revenge Pains. I'm Serena, and I'll be back soon with another story.